fire hole to normal city fire holes. We have crash fire rescue trucks. This is one of them here. This is a 3,000 gallons of water. There's a lot of foam on it. We mix it with the water. We lay a rescue pump for aircraft in case anything ever happens.
Drive around in SUVs similar to that one behind you. Mine's parked over to the side. And he'll sit on the passenger seat. And if we're driving around, patrolling around the airport, and we see any bird activity, starlings or gulls or pigeons or anything like that, he gets all excited because he wants to get out and go chase them.
Right here. And then you can take some photos. We'll open the doors, but you cannot get off the back. They went out of service for 3 weeks. It was parked on the terminal, and it happened, and then we had to tow it over to another part of the airfield. Yeah. And they had to build a little tent over it so they could fix the wing before it could fly off. Now, this is where those 500 people on board were pretty upset because they were on their way to somewhere for Christmas, and now they're going to have to be reaccommodated. United Express that we saw coming in earlier. This is probably going to Newark, and then we've got another United Express. Also, one of them maybe Chicago, one Newark. I'm not sure where they're going. And then when we come around the corner here, we'll talk about some of these other buildings. Look, the fire department's on the way to another call. What on earth is going on today? So all the other aircraft you see around here are departing to the United States. We have to spend money sectorizing the terminal so that we can divide up passengers going to the U.S. because they have to go through U.S. Customs before you board a flight to the U.S. So back to baggage for a second. I was mentioning that we do 33 million passengers a year. We do about, on an average day, probably 90,000 passengers. And on an average day, probably 74,000 pieces of luggage. It's an Airbus 319. We call it the baby bus. It's, I think it's about 120 seats, and there's two of them actually. But the first one says Jets on by the front door there, J-E-T-Z. So that is a special configuration. They actually only have 60 seats on it. They use it for hockey charters, football teams, and things. But sometimes they'll use it to replace one of the regional jets on a flight to Ottawa or Montreal. So it's a really comfortable way to travel.